Good afternoon and welcome back to Early Modern Europe. Today we're going to be looking at the Enlightenment. And it is an interesting time to do exactly that. We have just gone through in our last couple of lectures the scientific revolution, which definitely builds right to this, and also the English Civil War. And as we unfold today's lecture, you're going to see why the English Civil Wars actually were so important for this thing that we're going to call the Enlightenment. Because this really is, in the 17th century and into the 18th century, an opportunity for the intelligentsia, the educated elite of Europe, to think about taking the next steps, moving forward. And this isn't just moving forward politically, but it's politics and philosophy, obviously religion and economics, most definitely technological innovation, and that sense of innovation then drawn through all of society. And so it's an interesting moment, it's an interesting time as they continue to think and to ponder and then to express and articulate just what this all means and where they're going at this particular moment. And so if the scientific revolution had provided for the new model of solving problems through rational thought and experimentation, what else could they do with rational thought and experimentation? What could they do moving forward using the tools that are starting to be put into place for the rest of society? And so it's not just the scientific revolution they're building on. It's not just the English Civil Wars that they're reacting to, but they're also reacting to the Reformation, the wars of religion, and the complications that all wrought. And going farther back, they're not only going to build on the scientific revolution, but they're going to build on Renaissance humanism. Because many of the ideas that we're going to talk about today are going to sound pretty familiar. And that's where it's really important that we started as far back as we did, and we gave ourselves this running lead because these things are connected. There's a through line of human progress and human innovation and an understanding that human beings have the capacity to make things better. And that's really what this is about. The Enlightenment is about turning that notion of the scientific revolution, that we can figure things out through rational thought and experimentation and apply them to everything in our lives. That we can actually make a significant difference. We are not just passive receptors of what the world throws at us. We are the ones who can author our own future, our own present. And that's what the Enlightenment is in many ways. And so if we are children of the scientific revolution, which we are, we're also children of the Enlightenment. And while the Enlightenment, not unlike the Renaissance, was most definitely begun in the upper reaches of academia and even, yes, the church and states and all the rest, in the most highly educated minds of the time, if that's where it started, it will filter down and it will have a significant impact on everything, which means that everybody is going to be impacted by the Enlightenment. Make no mistake, right? And so as we look at these bits and pieces of the Enlightenment, I want you to think about what it means for human beings to recognize that we have the skills and the talents and the vision to improve human society, to make it better, to make it more effective, to make it more equitable. And then, of course, the other thing that we realize is that the Enlightenment has been brutally slow in actually turning out this idea. And again, make no mistake about it, the people who were at the forefront of the Enlightenment had a tendency, a significant one, to just omit whole chunks of the human population. Many of them didn't think about women at all as being a part of this, even though they were going to be. They certainly didn't think about anybody outside of Europe as being particularly capable. Indigenous populations of the New World, right? The people that they were enslaving from Africa. Anybody that didn't fit into their preconceived notion of who was capable and who wasn't. And so the Enlightenment Project is, like all human projects, complicated and at times difficult. But at the exact same time, it pushed us forward. Human history is messy. There's no doubt about it. But the important thing about reading and learning our history is that it is incumbent upon us to continue to see how we look at those things that we've done in the past, and that it's okay to critique people and their ideas and what they've done in the past. Nothing wrong with that, especially if we take it as one of the through lines of the Enlightenment that we're supposed to be getting better at this whole human society business. And that's what they believed. They believed that human beings had the capacity, the ability, the skills and the talents to make society better. And if we keep revising that notion of who is a part of that full human society, that is a good thing. But this is why we study history. To see where we've done good things, to see where we have fallen on our faces, to see where we have been catastrophically bad at human history and at human society and treating people equitably. But also where we have planted the ideas that are still bearing fruit right now and into the future. The Enlightenment continues to plant these kinds of seeds, these kinds of ideas. And once an idea takes root, you can't dig it out. Once an idea takes root and begins to grow and flourish, you can't kill it. You can't. Once there, it is always there. But it's not trapped in time. Even those ideas evolve, because as with all living things, they grow. And since there are ideas, human ideas, they evolve, just like we do. And the goal, my hope is that we continue to widen what these ideas are all about. And so there they are, right? In the 17th century, getting ready to just launch out in this new thing. And what's interesting is that there's a few things that they're going to essentially say, things have got to go. Now, I'm going to give you a list. This doesn't mean that they got rid of these things just like that. But one of the things that they were really concerned about was the authority of religion. And so one of the things that they wanted to essentially take care of was to say, well, maybe we need to not move beyond religion, although some of them will, right? Many of these people are dutiful, faithful, religious people. But one of the things that they recognize about the institutions of religion that are dangerous, they're going to come up with a list of things that really do need to go. And the first one is dogma. Dogma is a little bit different than doctrine. Doctrine is what you believe, teach, and confess, right? That's a basic understanding of doctrine. Dogma is you will, thou must, right? It is an ironclad rule of the faith. Dogma is dangerous because it is certain. And if we learn anything in history, is that certainty is very problematic. It is the opposite of education and growth, and for the religious folks, faith. Certainty is the opposite of all of those things because it stops a conversation. It stops growth. Certainty, the 100% belief that this is absolutely the only way forward, that's not who we are, because we can't be that certain. You say, well, what about scientific inquiry, Dr. Grant? Well, very simply put, every scientific piece of knowledge that we have right now is a theory, correct? And that doesn't mean that we can vote on this. It means that it's true until we can prove it false. And so we test everything all the time. That is the exact opposite of dogma. That is not certainty. That is, we have a high probability of confidence that this is accurate. But even if we decide to blow that up, as long as we've got the evidence to show what's the next thing, then we can do that. And so what's interesting is that science, in many ways, and actual religious belief function in the same way. It's true until proven false. And then we tinker with those ideas and we move forward. It's an amazing thing. It's the opposite of certainty, and it's the opposite of dogma. Anybody that says this is the only way to think about it is crippled by a lack of imagination and a lack of growth. And so they said religious dogma, especially, right, that says this is the way it is and there's no other way, it's got to go. That's got to go. All right, so the next one is superstition. Essentially a belief in anything that has no basis in fact or observable phenomenon. None. Right? You can list a number of superstitions. Every human civilization and society has got them, right? You go through a whole list. And so they said, if there's just no way of even beginning to show that these things are possible, then maybe it's got to go. And you think, well, that does a lot to a lot of organized religion. It does. These folks are definitely mounting a very serious challenge to religion, right? That's okay. That's fine. Just means that religions are going to have to figure out how to talk about this kind of stuff in ways that take this stuff seriously. Nothing wrong with that. Seems to me perfectly normal, right? What they're saying is that just got to show us a little bit of proof, a little evidence, something that pushes us in that right direction, right? I have no problem with that. Next, traditional religion. And the key word here is tradition, meaning you have a religion based on tradition, and that's it. We do it because we've always done it. Well, that's not a good enough reason to do anything, right? Explain, talk about it, talk it through, express why it's relevant to you now. What difference does it make? Don't just say we do it because we've always done it that way. If you say, well, we've always done it that way, that's not a basis for doing anything, right? Tradition in and of itself does not hold weight, hold water. It's either good or it's not. It's either beneficial or it's not. We don't do things just because we've always done them. Right? There's a lovely old story, great kind of thing. It's a charming little, anecdote kind of story. There's a young family. They're hosting Christmas dinner for the very first time. Husband, wife, newlyweds, right? And they've got all the family over. And the husband and wife are working together on putting together Christmas dinner, and they're having ham, right? And the way this works is that the husband and wife, as they're cooking together, the wife says, don't forget, we've got to cut off the ends of the ham. And then look at each other and like, well, I wonder why we do that. Now, thankfully enough, the previous generations are in the room. So they run off and ask the mom, right? Because she was the one who cooked in the previous generations. Mom, why in the world do you cut off the ends of the ham? That doesn't make any sense. And she's like, I don't know. I always did it that way. Why did you do that? Well, because your grandmother did that. Go ask her. She's sitting in the other room. So the husband and wife dutifully run off and go ask the grandmother, Grandma, why do we cut off the ends of the ham? By this point, they thought it was some big cosmic reason, some spectacularly important piece of family history or trivia or something like that. Anything. There had to be a reason for it, right? Something to do with cooking time or the taste or something, right? Some kind of explanation that made sense. And the grandmother looked at him, utterly nonplussed, and said, look, because my pan wasn't big enough. Multiple generations, right? I'm sure you probably have heard this story before, but it fits really well. Don't just do things because you've always done them. You figure out why, right? My mom's favorite response when I would ask her a question, do you know something? Any kind of question about history or life or and if my mom didn't know, she goes, I don't know. And then she said the most important thing. Let's go look that up. Let's go find out. That's kind of an important thing. Anything traditional without understanding why you do it, maybe you should figure out why you do something, right? All right. Next, factionalism. Especially after the Reformation, you know what they discovered? That all of these newfound branches of Christianity didn't like each other because they were fighting about dogma and superstition and traditional religion. They were fighting about all those things, and all of a sudden these factions were tearing the countries of Europe apart. That's what the 30 Years' War started off as, a religious war. And they had the wars of religion in France. They were tearing themselves apart between Protestants and Catholics and different groups of Protestants and all the rest. I mean, even the English Civil Wars had a whole bunch of fighting about religion between the Puritans and the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics. It was a mess. Factionalism was slaughtering millions during this period. It had to come to an end. Nothing in religion was so significant that you had to kill for it. Tore them apart. And they recognized that if there's factionalism in religion, that's going to bleed over into society and politics and all the rest. That was dangerous. Hyper-factionalism or partisanship is dangerous, especially the kinds of factionalism or partisanship wherein we look at each other and we can't see each other as fellow human beings with a legitimate point of view. When we start to think that the other side is just of the devil or evil or corrupt just because they exist, that all of their arguments are grounded in bad faith, that's what we've done. And woof, that's dangerous. And so they said, maybe we shouldn't do that. Right? Now, the next one is not so much religious at all. Some of the Enlightenment scholars are going to come to realize that monarchy is a bad plan. Putting one person in charge of the whole show, not a good thing. Politically, very dodgy. It's bad for all sorts of things. And we have come to develop a very healthy distrust of autocrats, dictators, kings, queens. Anytime one person and one person alone is in charge, it's just a recipe for danger. I mean, all you have to do is look at the United States. The way our Constitution was written, the primary branch, right? If you look at the articles of the Constitution, the first article is about the legislative branch, which meant that they wanted power to be spread among all those people who were acting as the representatives of all of us. The executive branch is not the primary branch of government. The legislative branch, it's right there they legislate. They write the laws. They should be taking the lead on this. I don't care who the president is. They have too much power right now. Our legislators need to grow a backbone and get back to the business of actually being the ones who carry the main weight. There's a reason why we're afraid of monarchs. There's a reason why we're afraid of authoritarian regimes. You do not want to consolidate power into one person's hands. It's dangerous. And some of these Enlightenment scholars are like, oh, monarchy's a bad plan. And they were starting to see that. They could see it, right? Again, they were coming out of the English Civil Wars. They recognized that anybody who had too much power was a problem. This is where we get the idea that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why we have kind of an allergic reaction to people who coalesce too much power into their own hands. It's why even in the United States, our economics is theoretically supposed to be against monopolies. We don't want a corporation to have too much power either. They're just as dangerous. If you don't think that's true, look at what Facebook is doing. They've cornered the market, essentially. That's dangerous. We broke up the telephone company because they had too much power. The oil and gas industry a long time ago, the beginning of the 20th century, right? They were seen as monopolies and therefore dangerous. In any part of our society, when you put too much power into one person's hands, it's a problem. Politics, economics, heck, families. If you've got an autocrat in the family, right, that's a problem. And lastly, the Enlightenment scholars and the thinkers were saying the biggest problem in society is disorder, right? Disorder. There's too much chaos. And that chaos works against a functioning society. And so they're going to start building on a notion that we need to find a way out of all of that. And so they're going to build on the idea of the scientific revolution. And they're saying, okay, science and rational inquiry are going to be our common ground. This is what's going to bring people together. It's going to bring people together who have been previously polarized into Catholic or Protestant or anything else, any other factionalism. It's what the Declaration of Independence will call the pursuit of happiness. Is how do you bring people together using the gifts and the skills and our rational examination of the natural world and human society? How do we do that? How do we create this opportunity for everybody? It's an interesting thing, right? The Declaration of Independence, it really is one of the great pieces of writing from the Enlightenment period. The whole thing is just absolutely redolent with these notions of what it means to be human beings who actually use our brains to make society better. Because with the right use of reason, and this is Galileo, right, talking to the church, with the right use of reason, we could solve our problems. And we can not only solve our problems, but we can live prosperously, contentedly. That solving our social, political, economic problems is going to create a better civilization to live in. And that's going to lift everybody. And so one of the keys to the Enlightenment is a growing sense of optimism, right? That we can create something better, that we can lift everybody up, that these advances and this rational way of looking at the world and the natural order and human society is a way to make things better. And they could start to see it, right? They're starting to see it in Europe, is that the economy is improving all through the 17th century. Now, of course, we have to really recognize that the reason that their economies in Europe are getting so much better is because it's built on slave labor, which sours the whole project from our perspective rather a lot. I mean, they were literally building an economy based on the subjugation of whole groups of people. The growing economy of Europe at this time was based on slavery, and it was based on exploitative use of the New World. The Spanish were hauling so much gold out of the old Aztec Empire that they essentially were going to do some significant damage to their own economy because of inflation. But make no mistake, all of this new growth, all of this, it's based on exploitation and slave labor. And so you got to temper our excitement about what's going on. And you also have to recognize that a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers are going to have to really kind of hold two mutually exclusive ideas at the same time. There's, hey, human beings are rational and we can make things better. And oh my goodness, and slave labor. And they had to rationalize that. Now, I will say that some of the Enlightenment thinkers are going to say, wait a minute. We're building this good thing on a very flawed foundation, on a ghastly, grim, horrific foundation. Some of those Enlightenment scholars, interestingly enough, the closer we get to the 18th century and into the 18th century, will join up with some of their religious brethren and come to the same conclusion that slavery is wrong, fundamentally wrong, an evil that must be expunged. But they're not there yet. And so with all of our excitement about the Enlightenment Project, we have to recognize that a part of that Enlightenment Project was turning a blind eye to the subjugation of whole swaths of the human population. And so we have to be aware of that. We have to understand that. All right? But they're building, they're growing, and they're seeing that the steady economic growth is going to bear out the notion that if you use the scientific method, you can unlock answers not only to the physical world, as Newton and Galileo and Copernicus and all the others had done, but also to philosophy and history and politics and social problems. And so, using the advances made possible through rational scientific inquiry, we're going to get huge advances in farming practices and sailing techniques and astronomy and chemistry. You're going to get entrepreneurs who are going to experiment with new technologies and new products that are going to really move everything forward. You're going to get things, not least of which was back in the 15th century, the printing press, but all the way up through, well, steam. The use of mechanical engines. We're a long way from the internal combustion engine, but not really. And so all of this is going to continue to a constantly evolving human society benefited from all of these technological advancements. By the end of the Enlightenment, we're going to be full in the throes of this thing called the Industrial Revolution. So the question then is, how does all of this make humanity happy, rational, and free? Because if there is an ideal of the Enlightenment, it's those three things, right? The pursuit of happiness, rational thought, and freedom. And that freedom means a whole number of things. Political freedom, right? Meaning that we're not under the sway of a monarch, an autocrat. So political freedom, economic freedom. We're not locked into a caste system or the class system. Religious freedom, that your beliefs, you can run with them as long as they're not harming others. Social freedom, that you actually have social mobility. So freedom is multivalent, and it doesn't all happen at once, and certainly not for all people. I mean, remember, think about it. In In the United States, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote in federal elections. 100 years. That's not a long time, right? When the United States first became the United States, the only people who could vote were, well, white men who owned property. And so if you didn't own property and you weren't white and you weren't male, you didn't participate. It's not really a participatory democracy now, is it? But that's the thing. They're moving in that direction. And while they didn't get there all in one fell swoop, at least they were starting to move in that direction. And so the Enlightenment scholars and the Enlightenment Project, in many ways, is this notion that we try to answer the question of how do we make people happy, rational, and free by discovering the underlying laws which would organize all knowledge into clear, rational systems, enabling individuals to become enlightened and to create societies in which it was possible for everybody to thrive and progress. Science and reason seem to offer the key to the future, where anything was possible, where we could fix any problem. And it's an interesting thing. The question, of course, is how do you get there? And what needs to be tinkered with? And so we're going to look at that through the rest of the lecture, looking at some specific individuals, moving beyond just thinking about the conceptualization of it, and looking at how some individuals really started to ask specific questions and offered specific ideas. And so we begin with a guy named Thomas Hobbes, right? And Thomas Hobbes (1588 to 1679). So early, right? Hobbes really was one of the first who is going to explore these concepts. And it's an interesting thing because Hobbes, in many ways, felt a little old world. His worldview was not significantly different than some of the late medievals, but it was just different enough. Inspired and in the midst of the early scientific revolution, Hobbes was a mathematician. That's what his job was. We know him best for his political theory, but make no mistake about it, he was a mathematician. And his political theory was an effort to make politics into an exact science like geometry. He thought and argued that human behavior could be predicted by exact scientific laws. We call it political science for this reason, right? That looking at human society shouldn't be any different than looking at any other society or any other natural occurrence. That human society should be able to be understood according to rational scientific laws and maybe even then predicted. Now, Hobbes had been spectacularly influenced by the English Civil Wars, which he believed was evidence that people were ultimately selfish and competitive. And this is the very heart of Hobbes's idea found in the Leviathan, one of his great works. He wrote the Leviathan in 1651. So think about it. This is just after England has killed her king. And according to Hobbes, human life outside of the control of a human institution like a government, that we had lives that were nasty, poor, brutish, and short. That outside of any controlling system, human beings were going to always look out for themselves first. Period. He had what we would call a negative anthropology. His belief, right, the Hobbesian belief, is that human beings, if left to their own devices, will only think of themselves, will only think of their own self-defense. The war of all against all, that we are fundamentally without any kind of guardrails in society, no different than the beasts. And therefore we do need somebody or some structure in our lives, that we cannot live without rules and norms and a government. Hobbes articulated the notion that if we do not give some form of control to somebody, we are just going to tear each other apart. It's an interesting thing. Hobbes's negative anthropology isn't fundamentally different than Martin Luther. Martin Luther just articulated it in a way that was religious, theological, right? But it's the same thing, that human beings, if given the opportunity to do what they really want to do, are only going to screw other people over for their own self-protection and their own self-interests, right? That if given the opportunity for there not to be laws, we would exactly act like the purge. And worse, right? If you suspended civil authority, human beings are going to devolve just like that. That was Hobbes. And there are days when you really understand it. You're thinking, well, how in the world does Hobbes really essentially help kick off, at least in some ideal form, the Enlightenment? Why is he understood as an Enlightenment scholar when he was really such a pessimist? That's not optimistic. Well, he serves as a basis, but more so than anything, it was his belief that rational thought could be exercised by human beings in particular settings, right? And that what really needed to happen was for us to start thinking about these things very carefully and put in guardrails and create norms and make sure somebody is in charge. Because again, he was deeply influenced by the English Civil Wars. He just saw the chaos of competing forms of governance without any guardrails. And a lot of people in England are going to feel that same way. What do you do in a society when you could actually kill your king? That's a big deal. That has a lot of impact. And Hobbes is going to recoil from that. You need some kind of form of governance. People have to have structure, rules, guidelines, norms. We need them, or else, if we don't, it shatters. You know, it's kind of like parenting. You have to give your kids guidelines, guardrails. They have to know what's out of bounds. Because if they don't know, they'll keep testing the boundaries until something dangerous or catastrophic happens. I remember back when our kids were little, right? People would always look at us like we were the worst, most mean-spirited parents in the world, because I remember going up to the checkout line once with my daughter, right? She was really little at the time. She's in college now. She's your age, so, right? And she was looking at all the candy bars and stuff like that, right near the checkout, the way that always works, right? They do that because it's an impulse buy and they know that you're hungry and you're going to buy something. Well, and they're great for kids because kids are like, oh, nothing but want, I want. And so she asked, I said, no. She asked for a candy bar. I said, no, you don't need one. And it was before dinner. We're going to be eating soon. No. And she tried again. She goes, oh, come on, please. And then I said to her, I said, am I going to change my mind? And she looked at me and she's like, no. She knew the rules. She knew the guidelines. She had guardrails. And she was fine. I mean, she wasn't happy, but she settled back down, because she knew what to expect. There was an expectation. The hilarious thing is that the woman behind me was like, that's so mean. Your daughter wanted it. I said, right. And she doesn't get it. Right? That's the way that works. We have rules. We have expectations. We have normative behaviors. We have guardrails on all of this kind of stuff. She knew what to expect. We had a conversation about it, and we would have that conversation. And sometimes, after I would say, well, explain to me why you want something. And she'd explain it. If she gave me a rational reason other than I want, then we could have that conversation. But she knew in order to get something, she had to be able to explain it. She had to give a reason. She had to provide some evidence. This is the problem of having a dad who's a professional historian. But we didn't have any spectacular problems as she was growing up, going through all of the teenage years. We didn't have any rebellion. We didn't have anything like that because we talked about it. And she knew what the expectations were. And I wasn't a tyrant, but I had expectations. And the poor lady behind me, she's just, oh, it's just terrible, terrible. I was being so cruel to my child. How could you possibly do that? They're fine. She's awesome, right? Not because of me, but because she kind of knew what the boundaries were. Same with my son. It's a PhD student at the University of Chicago in molecular engineering. I think he turned out all right. Because they knew what to expect. That's what Hobbes is saying. Human beings, if we don't know what to expect, we're just going to go blah, right? Chaos. And again, for the Enlightenment, chaos was the problem. That is disorder. Your society is never going to get anywhere if it's rooted in chaos. We have norms for a reason. We have expectations for a reason. You want to challenge them? Fine. That's great. Do it the rational way. Plot out your course. Tell me what you're going to do. Tell me why. Give me good evidence. Give me good reasons for that. Because remember, they're thinking that everything can be read through the lens of scientific inquiry. And in order to disprove a scientific theory, you got to show your work. You got to prove it. You got to show evidence. Right? When Einstein did all the things that he did that essentially called into question Newtonian physics, he didn't just say, well, it's a feeling I've got. I want to just, this is my personal, no, prove it. And that's what they're going to say about all of society, including politics. Show your work. Right? And this is why we start with Hobbes, because he's turning toward this notion that politics is just another component part that we can understand because it's based on the natural world, and we're a part of that, even as complex creatures as human beings, and we can think our way out of these problems. It's no different than geometry, is what his thought was. Now, you can disagree with Hobbes, and a lot of people are going to, including people that I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, right? They're going to disagree, but they're going to have to show their work to tell you why they disagree. And that's the beauty of all of this. That's the beauty of the Enlightenment Project, which builds off of the scientific revolution and humanism and all the rest. It's pushing human beings to use our noggins in this lovely brain for the betterment of people. That's the goal. And so like the next one, a guy named Rene Descartes, right? Everybody's heard of Descartes, especially when we're thinking about philosophy. Descartes was born in 1596, right? Rene Descartes was a French philosopher, mathematician, scientist who saw that human beings had the ability to use our reason as the very proof of our existence. Right? I think, therefore I am. We forget that the fundamental idea of existence that Descartes was talking about was rational thought. Not just mere existence, not just mere exercise of power or authority or anything else. It was the fact that we were rational beings, that we think. As Galileo mentioned, right? That I can't imagine that God gave us this ability to think and then we weren't supposed to use it. So in his discourse on method in 1637, he's going to reject all forms of intellectual authority except the conclusions that he came to. Now, of course, the fascinating thing is that a part of Descartes' project is to prove that God exists. Here he is, mathematician, philosopher, scientist, and his first and foremost concern is faith. But he uses that, right? And that's a tradition that goes all the way back to the scholastics in the early Middle Ages, right? The marriage of faith and reason. Well, now they're saying, okay, well, let's just take reason and just run with it, right? It's like when we were talking about the scientific revolution. (1643 to 1727), nice young chap named Isaac Newton. He's as much of an important component of the Enlightenment as he is the scientific revolution, which kind of reminds you that these things are working concurrently and they go hand in hand. In 1687, when he wrote the Principia, right, in which he explained the universe as a mechanism, a machine, that it all makes sense, that it's all perfectly rational, and he talks about the universal laws of motion and gravitation to explain the whole thing. It's not hung together on a whim or fate or faith even. It makes sense. The mathematics is particularly clear. He presents a vision of the universe in which the most basic workings can all be calculated and understood rationally. It all makes sense. It all works according to something that we can actually understand. And of course, Newton, at the end of all of this, is going to say, and all of this is the work of a creator. Somebody put this all together. Now, his understanding of God was fairly straightforward, and that was that God essentially functioned as a clockmaker, right? This vast, beautiful, intricate machine that you can figure out through the use of reason. He creates this machine, he winds it up, or on the back, however you want to do it, sets it on the mantelpiece, puts his feet up in the recliner, opens a bag of chips and a beer, and watches the whole thing unfold. That was his vision of God, that God was the creator, the prime mover, right? Got it all going, gave it rules and laws that made sense and could be understood, and then let it go. This is the fundamental idea of deism, which we'll get to in just a moment. It's this notion that God got it all going, and then it's all going to work according to those natural laws. Which even that is just a fascinating idea, and it's one that reaches at least as far back as Anselm of Canterbury. Right? Anselm said, yeah, God created the universe, and this is back in the 11th century, for heaven's sakes. God created everything, set it up according to the rules, and has not tinkered with those rules ever since. Once God created the universe according to certain rules, God will then play by those rules from that point on. That's how Anselm, a medieval scholar, right? Priest, monk, archbishop, that's how he thought about it. And so this notion that the universe makes sense is fairly old. Isaac Newton just gave it the mathematics to make it understandable so that it could be repeated, right? That we could repeat the experiment and get the same results. And he developed calculus as a way of describing the whole thing. Think of that. Newton essentially created calculus during a plague, by the way, to express all of this mathematically. He had the ideas in his head, just needed a tool, and so calculus was invented as a tool to do that. It makes me feel like I haven't kind of done enough during this, our version of the plague, right? Newton is going to continue to build this notion that things make sense. The natural world makes sense. It's not a mystery. We just have to keep asking the questions and keep probing all of these things and using our reason, our rational capacity for understanding the systems that are already in place. The natural world is something that we can understand. And then people are going to start extrapolating out from that. Well, if that's true about the natural world, then that's true about everything. Remember, that was what Hobbes was saying about politics. Hobbes was articulating that politics is as much a part of the natural order of things as anything else. And so if we can understand, all the other sciences, then we can understand politics, because human beings are a part of the natural world. We're not separate from that. Which brings us to John Locke. John Locke, 1632 to 1704. He's a generation after Hobbes. And he is going to develop an entirely different notion of the basic nature of humanity. Because you see, as opposed to Hobbes, who had a negative anthropology, Locke is going to posit a positive anthropology, that human beings at our very root are good, and we want to do the good. And it's a fascinating thing, right? John Locke is responsible for so much, frankly, of the Enlightenment Project, the Enlightenment Ideals. And I think a part of it was that optimism, that belief that human beings, even if left to their very own devices, were going to try to do the good thing, the best thing, or at least the better thing. That human beings, without needing to be told, without needing to be encouraged, will go in the right direction. Now, I will always say that I'd like to be like Locke, but I tend to be like Hobbes, or think that way. I want to believe that Locke is right. I really do, in my very heart. And that's where my idealism comes from. This is why I'm a teacher in many ways. Because I want to believe that human beings, if just given enough information, will do the right thing. I want to believe that. And so my idealism hangs on that very notion that Locke wasn't wrong. That we just have to give people enough information. We just have to point them in the right direction. That people are good. But that part of me is a little bit more like Hobbes and Luther. And that if we don't give them some guardrails, I'm not sure. That's the tension. It really is the tension. It's between Locke and Hobbes, right? Interestingly enough, John Locke was a friend of Isaac Newton. He was definitely influenced by Newton's description of a universe as a vast machine operating by precise, unvarying scientific laws. He looked at Newton's universe, and it made sense to him. There's a tangible reality to it. And so he's going to start thinking about how to apply this notion of a rational universe into human behavior and human institutions. And two of the most important of all of his writings, one was about politics, the other one was about education. In Locke's two treatises on government, which is written in 1690, in the two treatises on government, he outlined a theory of politics based on people's natural rights: life, liberty, ownership of property. Notice he doesn't do the pursuit of happiness, right? It's a little too vague, right? All the other things can be very concrete: life, liberty, and the ownership of property. And so he is going to essentially articulate that government was a contract between ruler and subjects. Rulers were granted power in order to assure that their subjects were taken care of, their subjects' welfare, right? Your job as a politician, as somebody who is elected office, is not to enrich yourself, not to ensure your own power or to ensure the status quo. It is to take care of the people. Just like that. That's politics' job? Politics, the politician's job, is to look out for the welfare of the subjects. Right? That's how we understand the way that governments are supposed to function. The government, you get into government service, we even talk about that, government service, to take care of the needs of the people, not to ensure your own power, authority, or well-being. Right? You're not there to enrich yourself. You're not there to do all these other things. Your job is to take care of the people and to lift them up. That's Locke's fundamental notion of governance. And that stone thrown into the pond of human history is going to have a ripple effect that's going to last for a very long time. Still, right? It affects us still today. That's what we believe the functional role of political leaders should be, to assure their subjects' welfare. And you'll notice a lot of this language gets into the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. It's all right there. Those are fundamentally Enlightenment documents. And those are the highest ideals that the government is supposed to reach for. Because there's this belief, right? A more perfect union, that is an Enlightenment concept. 100%. The idea that we're supposed to be getting better the whole time. That we're supposed to be making things better for the people the whole time. That's the job. The job is not to enrich ourselves or to accumulate power if we're in politics. Our job is to assure the welfare of the subjects. That's your job. You're in politics, your job is to take care of the people. Seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But that is a huge component of the political understanding of the Enlightenment. You can see how Locke is going to have a huge influence on everything that is to come, right? He's writing at a time when within 100 years, we're going to see the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And both of those are going to take a hold of his ideas and run with them. Now, but of course, he's not just writing about politics. He's also writing in the same time, one of the most important essays he wrote is called The Essay Concerning Human Understanding. He wrote that in 1690 as well. He was a busy guy. The Essay Concerning Human Understanding is one of those just foundational documents that we should read. And that is just underscores the whole Enlightenment project because it goes to the root of how we learn. Right? In the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Locke asserts that all knowledge derives from experience. Right? Knowledge was neither innate nor revealed. Right? Now, those two things, it's kind of important. Right? Knowledge that is innate means that you're born with it. Right? You just know these things. They're God's gift to you from birth, from your status, from your family, from where you live, all this kind of stuff. And so some people argued that knowledge was innate. You knew it. It's like the people who say, I just don't get math, or I get math. No, you don't. That's not the way it works, right? There are things that you can do to actually learn how to do anything, right? Now, you may have proclivities towards understanding systems or patterns or things like that. It's like music, right? But make no mistake about it, nobody is simply born with knowledge. Everybody's got to learn it. Right? That's what he's arguing. Because, and this is an important thing, people were going to argue that some folks, usually the aristocracy, were just born with more knowledge than the common people, and that's why they were responsible for leading. They were in charge because they were born with that knowledge to lead. Well, how are you ever going to fix that? And a good monarch would say, oh, well, you're not, because we're just better. See how that entrenches a system? Well, you're never going to learn this, so my family is always going to stay in charge because we just know these things. We were born with them. No, you weren't. You were born with financial benefits and land and power and all that kind of stuff, but you weren't born with any knowledge that anybody else was born with. The other one is revealed knowledge. Revealed, well, who is it revealed by? God. So if God didn't tell you, you were out of luck. That's how people thought we learned. And there's John Locke saying, knowledge derives from your experience. Period. Right? Knowledge comes from experience. The books you've read, the life you've lived, the people you've talked to, the events that you've witnessed, it's experience. It has to come in from the outside, right? There's nothing innate, there's nothing revealed. It comes to you from outside stimulus. Everything that you know has come from outside, right? Now, here's the important thing though. For John Locke, knowledge, right, comes from experience, and it needs to be mediated through perception, right, and reflection. And I want to put those words on the board because they're really important. Perception and reflection. Knowledge comes from experience through immediate perception. We perceive. Sensation, right? We take things in through our senses. That's how we learn about the world. Okay, that's only the first step, though, because the second step, and this is really kind of an important thing, and a lot of people don't quite ever get there, it seems, is reflection. That's the operations of the mind in sorting and arranging those perceptions, right? So reflection is taking everything in and then arranging them in your head, using your rational faculties, right? As one of my favorite detectives, right? Crime fiction kind of thing. Hercule Poirot said, you must use your little gray cells. You've got to think things through. You've got to reflect on them. Taking in information is only the first step. Now you've got to arrange it. You've got to reflect on it. You've got to think. Right? It's not good enough just to simply take it in and shove it into your short-term memory. You've got to ruminate on it. Period. If you don't take that step, it's not going to do you any good. This is why classes that are fundamentally based on memorizing material, right? If that's all you're doing is just going, oh, I need to put this into my head, right? It's no good. Just cramming stuff into your short-term memory so you can puke it back up on an exam is useless. It doesn't make any difference until you've thought about it, until you reflected on it, until you've arranged it and categorized it and mulled and pondered, and then made that information your own. Once you do that, now you can say that you're educated. But just cramming stuff in your short-term memory and then puking it back up is a waste of time. Which is why I think most AP history classes are a waste of time, unless they're taught really well. Because all you're doing is you're just cramming stuff in so that it can be dumped right back out. If you never think about it, if you never reflect on it, it doesn't make any sense. All right. So in the essay concerning human understanding, it's a matter of understanding that how do we learn? Through experience. How do we get that in? Through perception. And then what do we do with it? Reflection. If you do that, then you can go in any direction that you want. And now you're off to the races. And by golly, that's important. It's what a lot of people don't do. Reflection, right? I mean, if you're not doing that, what are you doing? If your entire college experience, if all you're doing is cramming stuff in and never thinking about it, then you're wasting your time and your money. And I've said that for a long time. If I have a time machine, I want to go back in time and tell myself as an undergraduate, it's not good enough just to cram it in and get the grades. Because the things that I remember from college now, it's not the specifics. It's the big ideas that I wrestled with in certain classes and have lingered throughout all of these years. 90% of the details you're going to forget the moment you walk out of an exam. I have no illusions about the fact that 90% of this stuff that I've talked about over the course of the semester, you'll never think about again. But I hope in that 10%, I hope there's some big questions or a question that just sticks with you. If we've done that, if I've done that, I'll take it. Even if I've just gotten you to think about something in a different way, presented an idea that's going to stick with you and bother you for years. That's better than data, memorizing names and dates. If you've already forgotten when John Locke was born and when he died, that's okay. You can look it up. I'd rather you think about his ideas. If you didn't even remember that his first name was John until I said that, again, I don't care. I want you to think about his ideas and what impact they have on the lives that we live right now and into the future. It's the ideas that matter. And how they played out in history helps us to understand why they matter and how they matter. But it did take somebody to think them, to reflect on the world in which he lived, and then to write them down. Read the whole thing. The whole essay concerning human understanding is spectacular. I encourage you to do that. And those ideas will linger with you long after the names and the dates have disappeared. And that's fine. Whatever major that you go into, whatever career path you decide, you'll get the data. You'll figure that out. You'll learn all those things. Right? I am not great with languages. I still learned the 3 languages that I needed to learn. It was just a matter of doing it. Right? But it's the ideas that I've read in the books and the treatises of those languages that hold on far much more so than the grammar. because I can go back and relearn that. The ideas, though, man, those things resonate. And speaking of resonating, right? As the Enlightenment continues on, right? We're going to get a lot of people who are going to say, okay, let's run with these things. Let's continue to build on these ideas. And so the ideas and this analytical method employed by Locke and Newton and others is going to encourage others to develop theories of government based on rational approach to our relationship with the society in which we live. And there's a group of them called the Philosophs, right? The philosophers. Essentially, the Philosophs are a bunch of French thinkers who are during the 18th century who are going to start really running with this stuff. And there's a whole collection of them, right? And the Philosophs had three basic tenets, right? Three basic foundational ideas. And they believed or argued that human society was governed by natural laws. And that these natural laws can be discovered by rational people. And that human society can turn from these traditional authoritarian forms of government and progress towards a more perfect government that's based on rational thought. Right? And so it's this group of scholars and thinkers and ponderers who are saying, okay, let's use these tools, rational thought, analytical structures, and apply them to government and say, okay, well, we can figure out how the natural laws work. We can figure out what those natural laws are, and then we can essentially create human society and politics based on those laws. The fundamental notion of modern democracies are built on the notion of this natural law tendency. That just by looking around, we can figure out the way things work. And then, as we go through the rest of the 18th century, especially in France, we're going to get the Salon, or the French Salon, right? These are gatherings for these thinkers and aristocrats, and they're going to discuss these new ideas, and they're going to bounce off all of this stuff, and they're going to challenge each other, and they're going to use these places as kind of a cultural hub. This is where we get the emergence of coffee shops in France, where they sit around and ponder the universe and the way in which you can think these things through rationally and that they apply to human institutions. And it's an interesting thing. There's a wonderful book called The History of the World Through 6 Glasses. And they talk about various beverages that we drink, wine, beer, all this kind of stuff. And one of them is coffee. Because coffee is different than wine and beer. Wine and beer are depressants, right? They slow things down, all this kind of stuff. Coffee is a stimulant. And so think of all these thinkers now just sitting around sucking down coffee all day long. They're all like this, right? They're amped up and caffeine laden, and they're coming out with ideas, and coffee was new for them. This is a brand new thing. And they didn't really fully understand the whole business of caffeine. They just knew that when they drank coffee, they were ready to go, man. Well, that powers, right? That little thing, that change of what we drink, right? Instead of slowing us down and mellowing us out, all of a sudden coffee is lifting us up and giving us the ability to continue to talk late into the evening. It's amazing. And so in these places, these French groups, right, of aristocrats and other thinkers and scholars, they're just trying to figure out everything. What's really interesting about the French Salon is how vital it was in moving forward all this, because you're getting a lot of people. It's growing. And yeah, it's still the aristocracy. We're still talking about the upper classes, right, that are going to be involved, because they had the one commodity that was so vitally important to all of this. Not money, time. They had time. If you don't have to work, if you have all of your expenses paid for, or the vast majority of them, then you can sit around at the salon and wherever they are and talking about all these different things until the cows come home, because you don't have to worry about the cows coming home or anything else, just your ideas. And so they start to do this, right? They're having these conversations and these collections of people, and there's something to be very honest about the natural give and take of conversations when you have more than one person, right? All of a sudden you're bouncing ideas and you're testing these ideas and they're exploding, right? It's like back with the ancient Greeks all over again, where they would sit and have these conversations. Now they drank wine, right? That's the whole in vino veritas, right? In wine there is truth. That they figured that you needed to be a little bit intoxicated to free the tongue to speak the truth. Well, the French, instead of using wine, used coffee to amp them up, to get them going, to charge them forward. But in both cases, the idea is get a bunch of people in the room and talk about big stuff and how to solve problems. And what's the unique thing about the French Salon is that there were a number of women aristocrats who were very much a part of this. People like Madame de Pompadour and others who not only essentially gave people the places to have these conversations, but also participated in them. And so for the first time forever, women are actually a part of the conversations and actually moving forward with these conversations. And they weren't automatically rejected. They were not automatically kicked out of the conversation, which is a dramatic thing, because essentially they were saying, well, if humans are rational, that means that's everybody, including women. So if women have these ideas, then we should listen. Yeah. Took them a while, took them a long while, and there's still people today who don't believe that, right? Why do you think it's taken the United States so very long to actually even have somebody who was elected to the vice presidency to be a woman? Every other major modern nation has already gotten there. In the United States, we're dragging our feet because misogyny is a thing. It's been a thing throughout human history. I wish it hadn't been. It's an amazing thing that one half of the population decided that the other half of the population wasn't like them and that they weren't, right? It just hurts the head. But there they are in the Enlightenment, in the French aristocracy, and there are women who are participating. That's important. We haven't seen that kind of female input since, frankly, the early church, which is, yes, there are all sorts of women who were leaders in the early church, in the Christian church. Make no mistake about it. But men, being who they are, tended to write them out. That's a different story. All right, so there they have it. The salons, there all this kind of stuff. You have lots of buzz, you have lots of things. And one of the things that they're going to do is something really concrete. And this is just really important because they're going to create something called the Encyclopedia, which is just simply French for the encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is just a compendium of all knowledge, much as they can get their hands on. And one of the major achievements of the Philosophs from the 18th century was this. It was begun in 1745. They completed it in 1765. One of the foremost editors was a guy named Denis Diderot. Jean-Laurent d'Alembert was one of the other editors. And by the time they were all done, they had cranked out 28 volumes of knowledge, 72,000 articles, give or take, about everything that we knew about the natural world and about politics and history and religion and philosophy and you name it. Think of Wikipedia, but in book form. Seeing Wikipedia was just an encyclopedia in digital form. That's all it is. Not profoundly in depth, right? But knowledge, general knowledge, agriculture, machines, mechanisms, you name it, astronomy, all sorts, everything that you can think of, put in there. The idea was that they wanted to secularize learning. They wanted to essentially get learning for the broader people away from the Jesuits, which there's something delightfully ironic about being at a Jesuit university and saying, yeah, the Encyclopedia Project was to get that away from the Jesuits. Right? I whenever I get to this part of the semester for early modern Europe, it just makes me smile because the irony is just delicious. Because these guys were trying to say, okay, the Jesuits, they're only giving you a very religious perspective on everything, even mathematics and science and all the rest. And like, that's awesome. I mean, the Jesuits were at least interested in education, but we'd like to give you an education that is more secular. I love the whole notion of it. Not surprisingly, the encyclopedia was banned by the Catholic Church. Oh, no, can't have that. But it's really just a secular compendium of knowledge at the time. It's a great project, right? I mean, it's the notion is that this should be able to be accessible to anybody, to everybody. The Encyclopedia Project is one of those things that is just, the very fact that we even have a Wikipedia is an example of how important that basic knowledge base is. You have a question, you can go look it up. That's what they were thinking. That's why there are 28 volumes. I remember when I was a little kid, we didn't have the internet, right? We had encyclopedias. I don't know, go look it up. I remember spending so much time just reading encyclopedias. I was fascinated. They had, illustrations, they had pictures, they had descriptions of everything. It was all there. It was amazing. And that's the point. The point is to give people everything that they could use to make society better. Even a farmer can learn by that, right? That's what they were thinking. That if you showed them good farming practices or the new machines that they were coming out with to improve all this kind of stuff, to make society better. It's amazing. God, that's amazing. And there they were. I mean, and there's a certain amount of interesting intellectual hubris that goes along with the Philosophs, because they're like, if we just give everybody enough knowledge, they'll be better. But it was a great start and an important start. And scholars have known this for as long as we can remember, that building knowledge bases is a way to save society. It's a way to move society forward. The only way to improve society is for people to know more. Anytime anybody is trying to restrict what you can learn, that's a problem, right? Anytime anybody says, oh no, that's off limits, that's a problem. We should always be saying, let's open more doors. What's next? What else do you want to learn? Where else do you want to go? What else can we dig into? That's the Enlightenment ideal. And it's a good one. That one is a fundamentally good idea. It's the reason why, right, slave owners did not teach the enslaved people how to read and write. Because if you want to control a population, keep them ignorant. Nothing was more dangerous than somebody who could read or write. That's a lesson all by itself. They knew this. They knew that the best way to essentially make people free was to give them all the information. Open it up. Give people a chance to learn. That's really important. All right, a couple of other pieces to kind of wrap up is the whole business about deism that I talked about earlier. With all of this, it does move you away from organized religion, right? And a lot of these thinkers, they believed in God. They believed that somebody got this started, right? They're a lot like some of our physicists today who say, I don't know what happened to create the Big Bang, but we know that's where, that's a theory that this is where it got started. But these scholars at the time, well, somebody had to do that. There had to have been a prime mover, and we'll call it God because that makes the most sense. Something happened, right? But their argument was that God created a universe that made sense and then just let it go. And so morality and all that kind of stuff, that you learn that by reason, by human interaction, by seeing. They are going to argue that people know the good, right? You know what is right to do and what's wrong to do. And they felt that's where the whole notion of natural law plays into this, that just by looking at the way things work, you know what's right and what's wrong. And so religion became, for a lot of them, this thing that was just kind of off to the sides. And I think a lot of the reasons that they push it off to the sides is because religion had felt like such a problem for society for a very long time. And so they posited this great watchmaker God. Wound it up, created it, wound it up, set it on the mantelpiece. That was it. There'll be a reaction to that. And we will probably get into that in a little bit in the weeks down the road. But for right now, though, this is a reaction against all the disorder of the Reformation period and the wars of religion. And so they just thought that if we got away from that, maybe we would get away from that chaos as well. And then we see that in the way in which the Enlightenment progresses from this moment forward, right? Into the 18th and 19th centuries, we're going to start to see thinkers like Montesquieu, right? Montesquieu is one of those guys who came to respect the British political system of limited constitutional monarchy. He had stayed in England for a while, and he looked at what Locke was writing, and essentially he argues the notion that human and natural and divine laws guide all things, including forms of government. And that the best way to figure this out is through empirical investigation. And so let's think our way out of our political problems. Montesquieu is going to have a lot of impact on the nascent American Revolution that's going to emerge later on that century, and the French Revolution. But there's this notion that he believed that a divided form of government, that constitutional monarchy, really seemed to be the right idea because it split power. And this notion of divided government as a way of making sure that nobody ever gets too much. For Montesquieu, that was particularly important. Or folks like Voltaire, right? Voltaire, who was 1694 to 1778, Voltaire was famous in his younger days as a playwright, a poet, right? Some personal difficulties forced him into exile, and all of a sudden he finds another Frenchman finds himself in England. And he comes into the contact with the people like Locke and Newton. And all of a sudden, Voltaire is going to move away from poetry and plays, as good as they are, and they're awesome, right? He's a dry wit, spectacularly creative. But England starts to resonate in his mind as a place of religious and philosophical freedom. And he starts to recognize that religious and philosophical freedom was important to everyday life and government. And so he starts to articulate notions that what government needs is more openness, more participation, more freedom. And now remember, in the 18th century, he's talking about France at a time when the whole notion of absolute monarchy was the idea of the French court. They had been clinging to that for a long time. And so all of these French thinkers are thinking about England and the way in which it kind of got through its troubles with the English Civil Wars and said, you know, what we've got, that's not nearly as good. And it seems to be antithetical to this whole Enlightenment project of lifting up and serving the needs of your subjects. The French monarchy seemed to be only focused on preserving its own institutional realities, the status quo. And then there's folks like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? Born a generation after Montesquieu and Voltaire, and he's going to continue on this philosophe tradition. He's an outspoken critic of the French social and political order. And his major work, The Social Contract, right? Rousseau rejects the existing forms of government in favor of a community based on the choice of all of its citizens, and the way in which all of those citizens participate in every major decision. Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract is saying that the leaders have, to give, and then the people give. That's what a contract is. And a social contract is this notion that if you do this, then this will happen, as in all contracts. But in all contracts, each side gives something. And he saw the French monarchy would only take. It would never give. It only preserved itself. It wasn't actually there for the people. And the more he thought about what was going on in England, and the more he thought about what Locke and others were writing, the more he thought the only way that makes sense is for the people to be participating. It's got to be based on the choice of the citizens. And for that, something has to be ringing in the back of your mind. You're thinking, wait a minute, this is sounding vaguely like Marsilius de Padua, right? That the power relies in the hands of the people. Now, the Philosophs are going to argue that that power just is theirs always from the very beginning, that the notion of the social contract is that human beings, the power has always resided with them. So Marsilius, who said the power was given to them by God, that's not what they're talking about, right? There's not that direct kind of connection. But what they're saying is very similar, right? These are things that have evolved from the Middle Ages. This notion that the people are the heart of this whole political reality is really just spectacularly important. And so the Enlightenment Project is pushing forward all of these ideas, but especially in politics, moving away from monarchy, moving away from dogmatism and tradition, and you do things because that's the way the status quo has always been, right? To the point in which it's us. It's our rational ability to think through society's problems. And we're going to address this through education and through economics and philosophy and politics and, yes, science and even religion. We have the ability to think our way through all of these issues, and And this is the fundamental concept of the Enlightenment: make it better. We take a machine and we tinker with it. We fix it, we improve it, we perfect it. Remember, a more perfect union. That's the fundamental reality of what's going on in the Enlightenment. And we kind of put a capper on it with a Scottish thinker named David Hume. Hume was born in 1711, dies in 1776. He belongs to what we call the Scottish Enlightenment. And the reason why we end with Hume is because he really is the founder of the modern version of skepticism. And this is important because the Philosophs, in many ways, and a lot of the Enlightenment scholars had gotten so enamored of our ability to learn and our ability to understand, and that scientific knowledge is the end goal, and this rationalism. And he's saying, yeah, our senses can deceive us. Scientific knowledge is probable. That we can't make the mistake of replacing religion with science, because then it's just magic. If we don't understand it, if we don't understand that these things are probable, not absolute. And so David Hume reintroduces the notion of questions. And that's really healthy. It may be the most important thing that come out of this part of the Enlightenment, because even the fact that the sun is going to rise tomorrow is not a certainty. It's very probable, but it's not certain. And I love that. It's what I've always been talking about in history. Nothing is inevitable. There are things that are simply more probable. Now, you can put the probability at a very high rate, and we can do that in science. We can do that in politics. We can do that in economics. But remember, I mentioned at the very beginning that dogma, religious dogma, is dangerous because it's all about certainty. They know. Just ask. And there's no brooking any kind of conversation. And Hume says you can't do that with science either. That scientific dogma, political dogma, economic dogma is just as bad. Right? Rational knowledge, while true if the rules of logic are obeyed, does not create empirical fact. And that while things may be probable, it doesn't mean that they are certain. Hume wants to essentially develop that the fact that there's a fact-value distinction. Empirical, observable facts do not generate or prove values as to what is good or bad, just or unjust. They are just observable facts. And then it's up to us to explore how that works and what that means. And so ending with Hume is really important, fundamental to the whole Enlightenment project, because you can't just replace one concrete belief system with another. That would be contrary to the Enlightenment and contrary to rational thought. And that there are facts and then there are values. And you've got to build one off of the other, but they're not dependent. That takes, again, reflection and a certain prudence and humility. Sometimes what we have to admit is that we don't know. And then you say, okay, let's go find out as much as we can. And then we move forward. The Enlightenment Project believed that through rational thought that they could improve every aspect of life. And they almost turned it into a fetish, as if that was the only thing. Hume reminded them that it's more complicated than that. Now, I'm reducing Hume and his conceptualization dramatically, but you get the drift, and it points you in the right direction. The Enlightenment Project is going to affect so much of what we understand about the way in which we live. But it's not the be-all and end-all. It's a step, an important one. Make no mistake about it. And it's going to help trigger the revolutions that we're going to talk about. But Hume is just as important because he reminds us that all dogma, wherever it comes from, is a problem. Because dogma is the end of growth. And if we're not growing, we're dying. And we may not even know it. The Enlightenment Project says that we should use our brains. Good choice. But let's not stop. Not even once we realize that we have to do that. And that's probably a really good place to stop. And you're thinking, well, I hope so. This has been going on forever. But it's important, especially right now. And so, thank you. I look forward to seeing you next time, and we will jump right back into it with the French Revolution. Thanks.